Hi, everyone. My name is Juliet Meccia, and I am a patent and data analyst from Porta Sophia, a nonprofit psychedelic prior art library and patent monitor. My colleague Shahin, Jeremy Rolquin, and I are so thrilled to be hosting and participating in this fantastic webinar series that's aimed at raising awareness of Indigenous knowledge, traditions, and rights in psychedelic intellectual property. Our goal is to empower Indigenous communities by providing a platform to share knowledge and reach a broad audience of individuals and stakeholders who are in the psychedelic sector. So today, my colleagues and I will be speaking as scientists and intellectual property experts, sharing tools to understand and spot threatening patents of many varieties, and show you how anyone can take action to promote good patents. Before we begin today, I'd like to give everyone a brief overview of what Shahin, Jeremy, and I will be speaking about today. So I'm going to talk about how the explosion of the psychedelic field over the past few years is directly linked with a massive increase in psychedelic patents, claiming natural plant and fungi-derived compounds that have been used by Indigenous groups for millennia. I'm going to go into more detail about why psychedelic patents with overly broad claims are dangerous to the field and to Indigenous groups in particular, and walk us through a unique process that's called third-party intervention and can be used by anyone interested in contributing to the protection of the space. Then I'll pass things over to Shahin, who will go into more detail about the specifics of claims charts as an integral component of third-party observations, review the impacts of Porta Sophia's workstream here, and highlight positive actions currently underway to combat claims that infringe Indigenous rights. Finally, Jeremy is going to explain how recent increases in patent applications claiming chemical structures covering existing psychedelics, analogs, and nearly infinite potential derivative compounds are a direct threat to Indigenous practices. Jeremy will walk us through two case studies using ayahuasca and ibogaine as examples. And finally, he will share about a novel chemical structure search tool from Porta Sophia that is patent specific and aims to address a gap in the intellectual property space. So let's get started. It's hard to ignore the current psychedelic hype bubble, which some have branded the psychedelic renaissance. And countless individuals and entities are promising to make really significant advances across all stages of the research and development pipeline, with the ultimate goal of bringing psychedelic therapeutics to market. And this well-established route of bringing molecules to medical practice is standardized in academic and pharmaceutical research. Many entities right now are receiving widespread attention and are lauded for their groundbreaking and their risky steps towards normalizing compounds that were once considered fringe and taboo in Western culture. However, not everyone is aware of what's actually behind this boom of interest and activity. So the huge influx of capital has resulted in entities and individuals attempting to co-opt and own the playing field through overpatenting. Patents, which are government-sanctioned monopolies over an invention, are not actually inherently dangerous and in fact are a super important part of stimulating research and development. However, overly broad patents that claim publicly available knowledge are a direct threat to essentially everyone that's operating in the psychedelic sphere. This includes researchers, innovators, clinicians, practitioners, individual users, and Indigenous groups. From our research at Porta Sophia, since 2018, we've actually seen a 37-fold increase in threatening psychedelic patent applications being filed in the US alone. And like I just mentioned, patents are an important aspect of innovation, and they help incentivize research and development. However, a large percentage of the patent applications that I'm talking about here are trying to monopolize knowledge and practices that already exist in the public domain. The process of patenting intellectual property involves many steps. So in order to be granted, a patent examiner must deem that the application's claimed invention is useful, novel, and non-obvious. Due to examiner time constraints and the staggering volume of patent applications filed, however, patents may be granted despite the existence of relevant prior art, which is the term we use in the legal and intellectual property sphere to describe existing evidence of a practice or an invention. The consequence of such granted patents can be devastating to individual users, practitioners, and members of Indigenous communities who have used psychedelic compounds as part of cultural practices. The owner of a granted patent has legal standing to pursue litigation against anyone or any entity that infringes upon their claimed invention. So, if you imagine that you're an individual who uses a psychedelic drug in a natural form for any reason, could be therapeutically, recreationally, or as a ceremonial or traditional practice that's integral to your culture. You may not be aware that a corporation actually holds a patent for consumption of the drug, for example, an ayahuasca preparation or psilocybin-containing mushroom, and this entity would have grounds to pursue litigation against you. What I've just described here is at the heart of Porta Sophia's mission. So Porta Sophia operates a multi-step intervention strategy to ensure that good psychedelic patents that do not contain these overly broad claims, are promoted. And how we do this is we start off by tracking all new United States Patent Trademark Office and World Intellectual Property Organization applications and granted patents weekly. We focus on those that are pertaining to 30 psychedelic compounds that are on our shortlist. We triage the threat of these applications and patents by looking at the breadth of claims to determine the presence of any shortlisted compounds, and search through the patent data and embodiments to determine whether the information that's provided in these sections actually covers the scope of the claims. Finally, we select high-threat, overly broad candidates for a process called third-party intervention, where we compile portfolios of existing prior art for submission to the USPTO or WIPO. And I want to note here that threatening applications are comprised of claims that contain information that's already available in the public domain. So this information might be in the form of scientific journal articles, books, patent applications or already granted patents, news articles, posts on Reddit, web forum posts, et cetera, et cetera. And all of these types of media, which are publicly available, are considered prior art, which I previously referenced. Thinking about protecting Indigenous rights in the IP world, it's important to consider that longstanding practices using psychedelic compounds may exist in domains that are unfamiliar to the Western audience. Think oral traditions, beliefs, values. Part of Porta Sophia's mission is providing a space to capture these practices, such as through this webinar series, for example, to ensure that innovators and patent examiners alike understand when patent claims are encroaching upon established knowledge. So, how is one supposed to intervene if they come across an overly broad, high-threat patent application? As I mentioned in the last slide, the USPTO and WIPO allow for the submission of collected prior art that a patent examiner may reference in their pre-grant deliberation. So a patent examiner, because they're so busy and swamped, may not have time to uncover non-traditional prior art through niche sources that are just relevant to psychedelics. So drug experience reports on Erowid, for example, or on Reddit, or maybe anthologies of Indigenous practices. Thankfully, the third-party observation process allows anyone to submit such information to these patent agencies in the hopes of protecting the public interest. So now that we've done a walkthrough of Porta Sophia's workflow here, I want to highlight a specific case study to exemplify an overly broad patent application that threatens known Indigenous practices, and also show you how anyone can use third-party intervention processes to contribute to protecting the space. So let's review a patent application that Porta Sophia actually filed a third-party observation for with the WIPO. So if we look at the information that's contained here in the biographical section of the application, we can see this particular example is from Journey Collab, which is a pharmaceutical startup. And this application covers the uses of mescaline, which is a phenethylamine alkaloid, for the treatment of substance use disorders. Mescaline is found in cacti such as the peyote cactus or the San Pedro cactus, and has a really long history of use by Indigenous groups that dates back to pre-Columbian times. This patent application was flagged by Porta Sophia as a Tier 1 high-threat patent due to claiming synthesized mescaline used in ways already known to the public. Regardless of the country of filing, patent applications are typically comprised of embodiments and claims, the former providing context and explanation for the latter. Examples of experimental data may also be included in the application. But here we can see we have the first tranche of high threat claims from Journey Collab's mescaline patent application. The first claim is the independent claim, as we call it, which typically lays out a basic invention, and the subsequent dependent claims build on specific aspects of the claimed invention. Porta Sophia thoroughly assesses claims to determine how threatening a patent application would be if it was granted. In the psychedelic sector, this typically has to do with claiming a known compound for treatment indications that could limit the public's ability to engage with a molecule or drugs of interest. And here's an example taken from the claims chart of our third-party observation for the Journey Collab mescaline application. And Shahin's going to speak a bit more detailed about the claims chart in the coming slides, but I wanted to highlight this here because we submitted prior art from a journal article that details the use of peyote, which is the cactus containing mescaline, in ways that alter substance use, abuse, and for treating alcoholism. And this example is specifically highlighting peyote rituals, which are a really culturally important aspect to many Indigenous groups. This drives home the point that if granted, this application was granted, the freedom that many people have to engage in such practices would really be at risk. And it's also important to reemphasize here that peer-reviewed journal articles, such as the one I'm presenting, are really commonly used and well-recognized sources of prior art. This example is also a great show of crossover between academic articles that capture Indigenous practices. However, academic and scientific communications are not necessarily a traditional medium of knowledge transfer for many Indigenous groups across the globe. A wealth of knowledge exists and has existed for millennia, and it's really important for us as scientists and researchers and publishers to create a more inclusive space that acknowledges and supports cultural differences in information sharing. So my colleague Shahin is going to be speaking more about the specific impacts of what happens after submitting third-party observations like the example that we've just reviewed, and how this work aligns with protecting Indigenous rights in the psychedelic space. So I'll wrap things up here with a short recap for everyone. The really important points to remember are that overly broad, high-threat psychedelic patents put the public at risk, especially marginalized groups whose voices have historically been excluded and silenced. Prior art in this space and from Indigenous groups may come in forms that are unfamiliar to academic and legal spheres, and we should work to recognize shared knowledge in a culturally inclusive way. Third-party observation exists as a tool for anyone to take action against risky patents and remains at the very core of Porta Sophia's operations in order to protect at-risk groups and the public at large from over-patenting psychedelic compounds. So thank you so much for listening, and now, Shahin, I'm going to hand things off to you.
Thank you so much, Juliet. So I'm going to be getting into the weeds a little bit about what these interventions look like. So third-party pre-issuance submission consists of a list of prior art references and commonly a claims chart. So like you see here. In this document, you juxtapose the claims of the patent application, seen here on the left, and quotes from pieces of prior art submitted along with this table that demonstrate that what is claimed is not novel and would be considered obvious to somebody in the field. Next slide, please. So taking a little bit of a closer look in this chart at the first claim, on the left, we see that the patent application claims a method of treating depression in a subject in need thereof, the method comprising administering an effective amount of psilocybin or an active metabolite thereof to the subject. And on the right, we have a quote from a peer-reviewed research study that states that psilocybin represents a promising paradigm for unresponsive depression, demonstrating that what is claimed is obvious and not novel and therefore should not be granted as a patent. Next slide, please. And these types of interventions are incredibly valuable for those hoping to protect Indigenous practices from exploitive monopolization. So by intervening at the pre-grant stage, we're preventing patents, essentially government-sanctioned monopolies, as Juliet said, from being granted and thus ensuring that public information can remain public. So with the rise in interest of psychedelics as medicines, many applications have been filed domestically and internationally that claim the use of natural psychedelics. For example, the patent that you see on this screen claims the use of mescaline to induce a psychedelic state in an individual that is being treated for alcoholism. So this is a current practice of the Native American Church. So if granted, this patent can be leveraged as a weapon in infringement lawsuits against those practicing what's included in the claims, threatening to limit cultural traditions utilized for generations. Next slide, please. So the threat that a patent poses is not limited to a single document. So it's common practice, once a patent is granted, to file additional applications in an attempt to create a patent family that expands the impact the patent owners have in the industry, essentially creating a patent thicket of defensible intellectual property. So this patent is actually a great example of how this strategy is put in action. So it was granted earlier this year and effectively sequesters microdosing psilocybin for use in treating a slew of different neuropsychological disorders. Three of the most egregious claims are on the screen on the far left. So first, we have psilocybin being administered in a range of 1 to 10 milligrams 1 to 6 times a day, using creative language to monopolize an incredibly common practice. So this amount of psilocybin can be taken in the form of natural mushrooms and their extracts, as shown in Claim 3. So an interesting feature of patent drafting is that one can define and redefine established scientific terms. So here, the applicant defined mood disorders to be far broader than what is used in the field of psychology, to include everything from depression and anxiety to premenstrual syndromes and addiction. So the two applications that are sharing the screen, that are seen in the center and on the far right, were filed immediately after the parent patent application moved to the grant stage. So as you can see from the claims of these two quote-unquote child applications, the dose range has been expanded and the amount of treatment indications has been significantly increased, putting a larger proportion of the field in the line of fire of potential infringement litigation. Importantly, it's essential for us to note that Porta Sophia filed third-party pre-issuance submissions against these two child applications, and as of this presentation, all pending claims have been rejected using Porta Sophia provided prior art. So the impact of a single submission also is not limited to the application it's submitted against. So prior art added to the file of one application will be available for the examination of all subsequent applications added to that family as well, further ensuring that the public domain is protected against unwanted encroachment. Next slide, please. So as of November of this year, Porta Sophia has filed 90 third-party pre-issuance submissions with the United States Patent and Trademark Office. So in addition to US filings, we've also submitted a couple dozen third-party observations with the World Intellectual Property Organization as well. However, we're going to focus in on the impact of our US filings because the time scale of this impact is much more immediately apparent. Importantly, though the time frame in which patent applications are examined compared to the rest of the world is actually quite fast in the United States, it still takes 1 to 6 years to receive a final decision. So Porta Sophia is currently the world leader in third-party pre-issuance submissions against psychedelic patent applications, making up 89% of all such filings. So looking at this table, we can see that 13 applications have been abandoned, 9 applications have received claim rejection, citing Porta Sophia provided prior art, and 7 applications have granted with narrowed claims. So of the applications that have received rejections, 92% of the claims in those applications were rejected, citing Porta Sophia provided prior art as well, forcing many applicants to reevaluate their intellectual property strategies in order to keep their applications alive. Next slide, please. So it's important to note that there has been a positive motion in recent years through existing legal systems, finally beginning to acknowledge some of its shortcomings that pose a direct threat to Indigenous practices, including those relating to psychedelics. So earlier this year in Geneva, the World Intellectual Property Organization adopted a treaty on intellectual property, genetic resources, and associated traditional knowledge, including knowledge related to medicinal plants and organisms that include many psychedelics. So this is the first new WIPO treaty in over a decade, and it's the first ever that deals with traditional knowledge held by Indigenous communities. As such, this treaty signals renewed hope that some of the current loopholes present in the patenting examination system that allows for exploitation of Indigenous knowledge, including that relating to psychedelics, are actually being acknowledged, and active work is being conducted to close them so that overly broad patents will stop being mistakenly granted. There have also been methods proposed that would allow Indigenous cultures to usurp costly patent litigation through leveraging the existing legal frameworks of sovereign immunity and cultural use. Importantly, these are proposals that at this time have not been tested in practice to our knowledge. However, these options demonstrate that the legal community is providing approaches in their analyses that can be of specific benefit to the protection of Indigenous tradition. Although there is positive motion being made in systemic contexts that can protect Indigenous use of psychedelics, these efforts may be too slow to protect against the patent applications that are currently at the examiner's desks from being effectively evaluated. So to date, there are existing blind spots in patent examiner methods that have unfortunately led to psychedelic patents being improperly granted. So until these system deficits are effectively addressed through legislation or policy changes, it's critical that those that have this knowledge utilize it to protect against egregious filings. So we here at Porta Sophia make all of our third-party pre-issuance submission information available, including the filings themselves, with the hope that our efforts can be used as a framework that others can utilize to protect the public domain. We also have prior art services, including those for third-party pre-issuance submissions, that you can use to call our attention to overly broad filings. And if those filings are already on our list of threatening applications, we'll file a third-party submission against that application at no cost to the individual or organization that notified us. Essentially, if you see something in a patent application that shouldn't be there, let us know and we'll leverage our database of prior art to make sure that the examiner has all the tools available for them to effectively limit the scope of that filing. And now I'm going to pass this to Jeremy to cover a little bit more into what sort of new strategies individuals are utilizing in order to sequester this field in more unique ways than we've seen so far.
Right. Thank you, Shahin. Next slide, please. Thank you. Hello, everybody. My name is Jeremy Rolquin, and I'm a chemistry data and patent analyst with Porta Sophia. As you can see from this graph, there has been a significant growth in U.S. patent applications for derivative structures of psychedelic compounds. From 2016 to 2022, there's been a staggering 1,433% increase in these types of filings. Notably, many of these applications focus on compounds either directly used by Indigenous communities or ones which are closely related to ones historically associated with Indigenous practices. This rapid growth raises critical discussions around intellectual property rights, particularly concerning the ethical implications of patenting compounds tied to Indigenous knowledge and traditional uses. The dramatic increase underscores the surge in innovation within the space, but also highlights the need for mindful engagement with these communities and their contributions. Next slide, please. Here we have a visual representation of key Indigenous therapeutic compounds, many of which are at the center of the surge in derivative patent applications discussed earlier. On the left, we see ayahuasca, which contains DMT, which is a powerful psychoactive compound traditionally used in Amazonian spiritual and healing practices. Similarly, mescaline, derived from cacti such as peyote, has been integral to Native American religious ceremonies. In the center, we have ibogaine, extracted from the root bark of the iboga plant, which is used in traditional African rituals and is now being explored for substance use disorder treatment. Lastly, psilocybin, found in magic mushrooms, has been utilized in Indigenous rituals for spiritual and medicinal purposes across various cultures. As we saw on the previous slide, the increase in derivative patent filings is often tied to these compounds, either through structural modifications or advanced characterization methods. This raises important considerations regarding cultural respect, intellectual property, and how to balance innovation with recognition of Indigenous knowledges and traditions. Next slide, please. Firstly, we'll examine examples of potentially infringing patents related to ayahuasca and its active component DMT. These examples underscore the ethical and intellectual property challenges surrounding the patenting of compounds rooted in Indigenous traditions. On the left, we see patents that involve combinations of DMT with monoamine oxidase inhibitors, such as this one from Remedy. While innovative, this approach raises concerns as it attempts to circumvent the Indigenous knowledge behind ayahuasca by substituting synthetic monoamine oxidase inhibitors for the naturally occurring components used in traditional preparations. The second example involves tryptamine compounds as serotonin 5-HT2 receptor agonists, patented by Shahin in 2024. Although this patent does not directly attempt to bypass Indigenous knowledge, it still ventures into territory closely related to DMT by patenting structurally similar compounds. These examples point to the increasing tension between modern pharmaceutical innovation and the respect for and preservation of Indigenous knowledge systems. As patent filings surge, especially for psychedelic derivatives, it is vital to consider how innovation can coexist with cultural respect and equitable acknowledgement. Next slide, please. Here we can see a few examples of potentially infringing patents related to ibogaine, which is traditionally used in African spiritual and healing practices. On the left, we see a patent by Atai Therapeutics, which focuses on methods and compositions for potentiating opioid analgesics. This patent explicitly mentions oral use of ibogaine-related compounds and does not directly attempt to circumvent Indigenous knowledge. Instead, it builds on ibogaine's known properties in new therapeutic contexts. On the right, we have a patent by Mirologics for anxiolytic compounds and methods of treating anxiety. This filing creates analogs of ibogaine for similar uses, raising concerns about whether it indirectly circumvents Indigenous knowledge by focusing on structurally modified homologs of the original compound. These examples highlight the fine line between innovation and appropriation in the patenting of compounds with deep cultural and traditional significance. They underline the need for ethical frameworks that respect and acknowledge the origin of these compounds while fostering responsible innovation. Next slide, please. Analogs are compounds with similar structures that may have similar functions to known substances. On the top, we see DMT, a naturally occurring compound, and one example of a patented analog is tetradeuterdimethyltryptamine, which is shown on the right, which is not a naturally occurring substance. This analog involves structural modifications, including deuteration and methylene extension, making it distinct and patentable. On the bottom, we have ibogaine, another naturally occurring compound. Its analog noribogaine is created by removing a singular methyl group. Noribogaine is also a metabolite of ibogaine and has a slightly different structure and function, qualifying it as a patentable analog. These examples highlight how structural modifications allow for the creation of new patentable compounds derived from naturally occurring substances. While this drives innovation, it raises ethical and legal questions about the balance between leveraging naturally occurring compounds to make slightly modified analogs with similar properties to those taught by indigenous practices. Next slide, please. Analogs are patentable versions of naturally occurring compounds or known synthetic compounds. To create these patentable analogs, various chemical techniques are employed by patent applicants, including the use of radioisotopes, modification to crystal forms, and the addition or removal of chemical moieties. However, this raises important ethical questions, particularly when these analogs are derived from compounds used within indigenous practices. Is it ethical to patent compounds that are analogs to substances with deep cultural and spiritual significance to indigenous groups? Furthermore, if such compounds are patented, how can equity be ensured for the communities and groups most affected by this work? These questions are central to the discussion of fairness and acknowledgement in the growing field of psychedelic and therapeutic compound patents. Next slide, please. Porta Sophia is currently in development of a psychedelic derivative search tool, which is a cutting-edge resource designed to aid in navigating the complex landscape of psychedelic patents. This tool is chemistry-focused, specifically tailored to identifying derivative compounds related to psychedelics. One of its most impactful features is the ability to identify patents claiming compounds associated with indigenous use, providing a clearer view of the overlap between traditional knowledge and modern intellectual property claims. The tool is expected to launch in early 2025, offering a valuable resource for researchers, legal professionals, and policymakers to ensure transparency and ethical practices in this rapidly evolving field. Next slide, please. In conclusion, high-threat, overly broad patents pose a direct risk to the rights of indigenous groups around the world. These patents can appropriate traditional knowledge without proper acknowledgement or benefit sharing. Second, third-party interventions are increasingly vital. Psychedelic activists and organizations are stepping in to challenge these patents, setting the record straight on what is truly patentable. These efforts are gradually pushing the system to recognize and address its current deficits. Finally, we see a trend where companies use chemistry-focused patent applications to claim compounds derived from or related to those in indigenous practices. This raises significant ethical concerns and highlights the importance for maintaining accountability in how these innovations are handled. These points underscore the critical need for fair, transparent, and equitable practices in the patenting of psychedelic compounds and their derivatives. Next slide, please. As always, many thanks to all of our supporters and collaborators. Next slide, please. Thank you all for joining us today. We hope you've enjoyed the insights shared by our panelists. Please visit the Porta Sophia website to learn more about how we are protecting indigenous psychedelic knowledge at portasophia.org. If you have any questions, we'd be happy to answer now. If not, please contact us through our website, and we are more than happy to connect. Thank you.
we'd like to invite anyone that has a question to feel free to pop it in the Q&A chat box. It should be in the top bar of the webinar window. So we can't see that you're there. We see that several people are in the audience, and this is the way that the webinar is set up to ask questions. And like Jeremy said, you can find us online. All of our email addresses are available on our website, and you can get in contact that way as well if you need to marinate, if anything comes up in the future. But we'll give everyone a couple minutes now in case any questions pop up. And we wanted to extend a huge thanks again for attending. I don't see any questions filtering in, so I think that we can call a day. Thanks again. And yes, feel free to get in contact with us through our website and emails if anything comes up.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.